Well, this is Marna Weston for the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, actually in Pugh Hall this morning, which is June 29th, 2012. And we have the honor of speaking with a very well-known Gainesville activist and citizen in our area, Mr. Jack Price. Good morning, Jack, and thank you for speaking with us today.
Good morning, Mona.
Could you please state and spell your full name from birth?
My full name is Lee J. Price, and J is J-A-Y, so it works either way with the full name or the initial. I'm also known as Jack Price, and I'm probably known by both names by a number of agencies around the country, around the world.
Okay, sounds like it's going to be a very interesting interview. What is your place and date of birth?
I was born actually in Vero Beach, Florida, but I have no memory of that because my parents, both of whom were alive at the time, moved to Jacksonville, and my father was killed when I was quite small, and my mother struggled with alcohol and died when I was a teenager. I was adopted by my grandmother and her husband, and given the name of Price at that time.
What is your date of birth?
October the 11th, 1929. October the 11th also is the birthday of Eleanor Roosevelt, although there were a few years difference. But I think that perhaps that was an appropriate date because it sort of set the direction of my life and civic and political activities, and certainly what I thought of the world.
Mm-hmm. What were your mother and father's names?
My mother's name was Myrtle Fugate, F-U-G-A-T-E.
And your dad?
Pardon?
Your dad?
Now I can't even remember. Oh, please. I'm sorry. He died when I was very small, and I never met him.
How about your grandparents? What were their names?
Well, my grandmother's name was Emma Price, and her husband was Robert Lee Price.
And where were they from?
They were Jacksonville, old Jacksonville. Mm-hmm. I grew up in an area of Duval County, which was settled. It was semi-rural, but most of the people who lived there were employed by either the seaboard of the Atlantic coastline or the Southern Railway. Jacksonville was a major railroad hub, and of course those were well-paying union jobs, so that for people who were working class, they certainly were able to afford and live better than the other people. It was a very racist atmosphere. Jacksonville was a very racist town. I suspect it probably has elements of that left.
What leads you to characterize Jacksonville as racist at that time?
Well, segregation was very intense, and there was also all this intense discussion about, during the period prior to desegregation, if a black were to eat in this restaurant, they'd have to break the china and throw out the silver. It was unbelievable. But I think you know that Jacksonville was a scene. I was not living there at the time, when the Klan had Axe Handle Saturday, which broke up anti-segregation protesters outside Woolworth on the downtown Hemming Park, which is the Central Plaza now, across from what was then Cohen's department store, which in its new iteration is the City Hall of Jacksonville. Mm-hmm. And it's really a lovely building.
What are your reflections now that the mayor of Jacksonville is African American?
Well, it was a very happy surprise, but Jacksonville probably has a much denser black population than the county, which is true of Alachua County as well.
We didn't talk about siblings. I know you have mentioned briefly a sister who has passed. What was her name?
Her name was Joyce Heufel, Heufel.
I'd like to ask you about your earliest memories of being at home. What kind of chores did you have? What was your family like growing up?
Well, I was growing up, we were involved in World War II, and I remember everybody was involved in supporting the war by large tasks and small tasks. We rolled up toothpaste tubes and crushed tin cans. We grew a victory garden. I remember helping neighbors because of the shortage of labor, help with the vegetables. We thought we were furthering the war effort, but everyone was involved, and also everybody knew somebody who was in the military. It's very unlike the very removed war in which we're now, which doesn't really touch anybody, and we've never been asked to even buy. In those days, we all bought savings stamps first. You got enough stamps, then you could convert it to a savings bond. So we were helping finance the war too. And Mr. Roosevelt imposed a lot of taxes on those who could afford to pay them.
In terms of family and friends, was your family, your community touched with losses through military service at that time?
Oh, yes. I think every family either had somebody immediately or they knew somebody in the neighborhood. It was a war that involved everyone. And then, of course, that was a time when, for the first time, women filled job roles that had previously been closed to them. And then when the war was over, they were told to go back home.
Did your grandmother or your mother work in the war industry?
No. My grandfather worked for the city of Jacksonville, and somebody in our family worked at the shipyard. Jacksonville was also producing ships in those days for the war effort.
You speak so reminiscently and fondly of the community
I'm not so sure it was so fond. I actually got out of Jacksonville as quickly as I could.
How would you contrast that sense of community with what exists today?
Well, since I haven't lived there since I became an adult, but I still have a diminishing number of friends there. But the city has grown, but whether it has actually expanded its view, I'm not so sure. I joke that Jacksonville was the second largest city in Georgia, with none of the charms of Atlanta.
That is quite charming. Your earliest education, where did you first go to school?
I went to school in the public schools, Grand Park, which was very near the various railroad facilities. It was a white school. Everything was very intensely segregated.
What type of impression did that leave on you as a young person? Did you recognize that there were differences, or did it cause you to ask questions?
I think my awareness was not immediate. I think, but I could sense that it's something fundamentally wrong with this system. And
what was it that seemed fundamentally wrong to you?
Well, that we restrict the opportunities for a large part of the population. Jacksonville was a very deep southern city.
Who was your favorite teacher in elementary school?
I had several very strong teachers. I remember them. My teachers introduced me to the broader world. I remember to this day that on several occasions the WPA orchestra, which was part of the arts project, which sustained the art, came and formed, and as they played the William Tell Overture, some wise-ass student yelled out, "Hi-yo, Silver!"
Because of the Lone Ranger, of course. Any individual teachers come to mind?
Pardon?
Any individual teachers?
Yeah, I remember them, but I can't specifically measure their influence. I had the pleasure of meeting people in the community who introduced me to new ways of thinking, and so I was very fortunate in having formative relationships with people who were not bound by the narrow views of Jacksonville.
Do you recall your elementary school principal's name?
Major P. Brooke, who was a retired British military, and it's not a fond memory, but anyway, but it was P. I don't know what it was, Patrick or what, but it was signed Major P. Brooke with an E on the Brooke.
When you left elementary school, did you go to a middle school? Or
yes.
And what was that middle school?
I went to Kirby Smith, and then to Andrew Jackson, and then I did some work at what was then the community college.
At Andrew Jackson High School, what subjects come to mind as having meaning for you, and what clubs and organizations, if any, were you involved in?
Well, I don't remember. Since we were bused to Andrew Jackson, my involvement with other acts, I was very involved with a student chapter of World Federalists, which was looking at reconstituting the old League of Nations as a much more robust global instrument. It actually would have been, much more robust than what came into being, which was the United Nations.
Now, did this have something to do with your fondness for Eleanor Roosevelt, or was there?
Well, I don't know that Mrs. Roosevelt was actually directly, but you have to understand that Mrs. Roosevelt, in the white community, was the most despised individual in America.
Oh, really? How so?
Ask them. But when there was the story that the black domestic workers were organizing to seek, better pay and working conditions, it was because they were constituted in Eleanor Roosevelt clubs. This was the common. So Mrs. Roosevelt was certainly although the antipathy did not extend to Franklin Roosevelt, because almost everyone I knew had been rescued from starvation by the New Deal. And some of their grandchildren are now big Republicans.
Do you have memories of the period we call the Depression, and what it was like growing up during that time?
Well, since I was living in a household where my grandfather was on a steady payroll, we weren't. But I do remember my grandmother preparing plates and setting it out so that the people who were drifting through in search of jobs could have a meal.
And were many of the communities organized in that way to offer some kind of relief, some kind of help to people if they could?
I don't recall it being particularly organized.
So you graduated from Andrew Jackson in what year?
1947.
Okay, so the war had ended. But before I go along those paths, I'd like to ask you about some things related to World War II. Do you remember when you first heard about Pearl Harbor?
Oh, I certainly do. We were at a rodeo at the old Gator Bowl when the announcement came that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And that was, I also remember when we heard of the death of Franklin Roosevelt. Now that was universally mourned in the city.
what were the things that you remember strongly from hearing about that?
Well, I remember that. I experienced it. So he was, I think, credited with having rescued America. The Depression really was very deep and heavy and difficult for the majority of people in the country. Mm-hmm. And it was Roosevelt who had the vision of creating stipend. So you had writers, of which Stetson Kennedy and Zora Neale Hurston was on the Writers Project, and you had the orchestra, you had the theater project, which I'm somewhat aware of.
Mm-hmm. So you'd have been 15 or 16 at the time that the president passed away?
Oh, it was 45. That was, yeah, probably 15.
Did you have any knowledge or thoughts toward the vice president who became president, Truman, at that time? What was your knowledge of him?
I was a supporter of Henry Wallace.
Okay.
I was born with a left gene.
Uh-huh. Well, now, what was it about Henry Wallace? And, of course, he was replaced.
He was dropped from the ticket and replaced by Harry Truman.
Mm-hmm. Why did you think that they did that, or what were your thoughts on that?
Well, I was disappointed in Mr. Roosevelt at that point. I thought that Henry Wallace, who had been a successful farmer and had done some scientific work in agriculture, edited the Farm Magazine, but he had a broad view of the role of government, and he had visions of government being the instrument for reducing poverty and hunger around the world. I mean, he was, I think, very visionary. I think in some ways he was a little naive. He later ran for president, and while the Progressive Party was not a creation of the Communist Party, there were communists, of course, who supported him, and some of whom had roles in his campaign.
Some have said
But I remember when Glenn, the Progressive Party's vice president, who was from Montana, I think it was, came to Jacksonville, and the rally was broken up by people throwing first tomatoes and eggs, and then it got so bad that the police closed it down. And
some have said in the years that have passed.
Jacksonville was a violent city in many ways. The reason I think there was violence was because there was a very elegant librarian, a black city of the municipal library, whose name was Olga Bradham, who had been selected as an elector on the Wallace slate for president, and she was on the platform. I think if it had just been those white boys up there, they might not have gotten so ugly, and it was really horrendous to see her all splattered with egg and so on.
You were present and saw this?
Oh, I saw that, yes.
Do you think that it was Mr. Wallace's very well-known feelings on equality and civil rights?
I'm sure that was a major factor.
And
he was not there, of course. Glenn, it almost came to me, but I can't remember what the vice presidential candidate, but his first name was Glenn. Mm-hmm. He was also known as the singing cowboy senator.
Okay. So he was actually a United States senator.
Yes, he was indeed.
Do you remember where you were when you heard about the end of the war in Europe?
Oh, yes. I was living in Jacksonville, and the city went crazy, absolutely crazy.
Did you listen to a lot of programs on the radio, sports or news?
Well, we listened to radio and we read the newspaper, and the newspapers actually had more content in those days than they have today. One of the issues that certainly defined my view of politics in the world was the Spanish Civil War. I have no explanation about why that was so definitive on my part, because I don't know anyone else who was very interested in it. But the Florida Times-Union actually had pretty substantial coverage, and I remember when they had this story about the Franco juggernaut having gone to the sea, separating the Spanish, which was the signal they were moving the end. And I was very upset because the Florida Times-Union had a picture of Franco's exultant soldiers holding up their weapons in the Mediterranean. And I knew that it was going to be over very quickly.
Did you know of any people who fought with the
I didn't at the time,
brigades?
But I did later.
Mm-hmm. Who did you meet that went and fought in Spain?
Well, when my grandmother was very ill, we, in those days, you got your registered nurses through the Visiting Nurses Association, who ran a roster. It was a professional placement agency, and they sent out a nurse whose name was Rose Waxman, who had been a nurse in Spain, and then had been a nurse in the military during World War II, and she had worked in Jacksonville. Immediately after the war, there were 2 floating hospital ships to treat venereal disease cases, and she was a nurse who worked. And having completed that work, those ships moved away, so she was now available as a registered nurse through the Visiting Nurses Association registry. And so I was, when I learned that she had been in Spain and in Europe with World War II, I was fascinated, and I stayed in touch with her until she died.
And what was her name again?
Rose Waxman. She subsequently was married to someone named Sorkin, and they at one time had a gasoline station in Miami Beach.
Now, is she the only person that you have direct knowledge of who was in Spain?
Locally, of course, I knew Jack Penrod, whom I admired greatly.
And was he in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades?
He was originally part of the Canadian contingent, which was blended in. And he, as I think you may know, taught English at the University of Florida.
I was not aware. So this whole concept, and for those that will be listening later and didn't have the background, people from many countries went to Spain to help the Republican elected forces fight against Franco.
The democratically elected legitimate government of Spain.
Exactly. But the United States and Great Britain and France would not lend credits to those to the legitimate government, and instead it was the Soviet Union that helped them.
They wouldn't allow even the sale of weapons to.
There was neutrality, and the people who went were called premature anti-fascists.
That's correct.
How do you think that this whole escapade of Spain of not supporting the democratically elected government and ultimately Franco winning, and of course him being neutral but kind of an ally of Hitler, how did it shape your worldview of how things looked at that time?
I continued to be intensely interested in Spain, but I think it also sort of set the tone for my great interest in democratic struggles, first in places like El Salvador, and then I had been elated when in 1971 the Chile elected a socialist president who was deposed in a coup in which the United States was involved in September the 11th, 1973, which is a date that also resonates both in 1973 and 2001.
Of course, of course. So it must be interesting to you through the course of your life to see that situation in Chile turn to the dictator ultimately being deposed many years later and then going to trial, and they sort of fill the arc of your life.
Trial, but
yes, of course.
But he was arrested in England, and of course I was very involved in Chilean solidarity while I was living in New York, and was part of a small group of Americans who were honored by the government of Chile in 2001, as a matter of fact. The event had been scheduled at the mission of Chile to the United Nations on September 14th, but there were no planes flying, so they had to reschedule it. So it was at the end of November.
What are your specific memories of the ceremony and the occasion?
Well, I was very flattered to be. It was a group of about 45 Americans, and I was, very flattered and very pleased to be, because I didn't think that my contribution had been that significant. So,
what was your contribution?
Well, I wrote letters by that time I had retired and moved to Gainesville. I wrote letters. In those days, the Gainesville Sun actually published some rather lengthy letters, and they didn't chop them up. It was the entire letter. So I was pleased about, and I did some contacts with members of Congress. I was living in New York at the time when our efforts, that the Carter administration ended all American arms sales to the Pinochet government, and I thought that was a great day.
Mm-hmm. Were there who were the specific members of Congress that you had contact with?
I was the Florida people, particularly Bob Graham, who never took a really strong position on the Chilean intervention. Mm-hmm. He's gotten much better on many things over the years. But I can't. Of course, Ted Kennedy was recurrently would go to the floor of the Senate and raise the issues of human rights and abuses in Chile and so on. Of all the political figures of my life, I think Ted Kennedy is probably the greatest member of the United States Senate.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, the day after the Supreme Court has ruled on the Affordable Health Care Act, we would come to Ted Kennedy. How do you think he would feel today from your experiences?
Well, I think he'd be elated, but I think he would also, if you ask him, would have said, I had hoped it would be a bit more. Mm-hmm. And I think had he been alive and involved directly in the political jockeying, which finally produced the Affordable Health Care Act, that he might have been able to have brought about a much more robust. But we welcome what we have. I've always favored extending health care to people who do not have it. This still doesn't cover everybody, I fear. Mm-hmm. And it may not last.
Why do you think there's so much controversy over this concept when so many of our peer nations, say in Western Europe,
I think Canada, it's because I think Americans have lost their sense of we make progress together. I think too many people have the feeling, well, I've got mine, to hell with you. That's your problem.
This is skipping around a bit, but since we're now on healthcare, I'd like to ask your opinion about our president, Barack Obama. What were your thoughts when he was elected, and what are your thoughts now?
I was full of all kind of excitement and hope and optimism. I think that he has disappointed in some ways. some very significant ways, but also he has been dealing with an opposition who have had only one purpose in mind, which is to make sure that he was not reelected. He's dealt with an impossible situation. I don't know how the country became that polarized, and I don't know how it is that we endured this incredible economic meltdown, and government became the one of the targets, when if the more legitimate target would have been that government should have been doing more robust supervision and regulation of financial institutions. And most countries, the electorate who are also impacted have acted that way. In Iceland, I know that's a small country, but that was the first country where it went totally bankrupt. The banks all failed. The people lost their savings, their pensions. They tried to burn down the banks. The bankers fled. They brought down the government. They elected a lesbian socialist to lead the government. So the banks are now doing business, but they're tightly regulated.
So,
and in France and other countries, there's been, but you know, we endured the savings and loan, which was going debacle, but a lot of people went to jail at that time. The failure to pursue what undoubtedly was criminal behavior at the highest level in the financial sector has just astonishes me. But the outcry is not about that. It's about we need to get government out of our lives. When I always tell people that I am alive, I can read because of government. I'm alive because of government. I'm dealing with macular degeneration. Medicare pays for my Avastin injections, which I certainly could not afford otherwise. And I would not be here talking to you because I would be needing a guide dog. So I'm in favor of government.
Why do you think that much of this anger and misunderstanding has been misplaced toward the government as opposed to the banks and corporations?
I have no idea.
Financial markets.
It puzzles, but also when I see some of the people who are yelling about they want to get the government out of their life, most of whom are beneficiaries of government.
In what way?
Well, they can read. They ride on public roads. They have safe drinking water. Hopefully, our food supply is relatively safe because of the government, I hope, is doing its job.
So you see the government more in a partnership and caretaker role to ensure that we're treated properly.
Yeah, and also I think there was a mindset when I was growing up that we make progress together. The whole country does a little better. We don't all do better at the same degree and in the same way, but it wasn't just about me doing better. And I don't know how that got lost, but it seems to be lost.
You mentioned something about El Salvador earlier. I wanted to follow up on that. In what way were you involved in the situation in El Salvador?
Well, I was living in New York. I was involved with a El Salvadorian support group, and I was also involved with a Sister City project with Nicaragua in New York, and then in Gainesville with the Matagalpa Sister City project.
Matagalpas?
Matagalpa. It was a high-risk pregnancy center. And the group locally, some of whom still individually send some money, and we occasionally have a reunion, but we don't have a functioning local group as we did at one time. Gainesville had sister city relationships with a number of places, of which Matagalpa at that time was one.
Okay. In terms of the mood of the country, you're discussing being involved with issues in El Salvador and Nicaragua and Chile and living in New York. Mostly, it seems you're talking about the 60s and the 70s. Do you think that spirit has been lost of being involved in issues bigger than ourselves?
There are a lot of people, but some of the people, who were involved in these things no longer live. And the issues have changed. But the mood of the country has changed. But some of the, Chile has returned to a relatively robust democracy, which is a very happy event. Spain, you got for a time what appeared the best of all worlds. They not only had the restoration of the king, but they also had a very robust democracy in which the king had played a very formative role in that development, to the surprise of everyone.
What do you think about the Occupy movement? Has that become?
I think the Occupy movement is a very rational response to the outrageous criminality of the financial sector. But I'm too old to occupy. But I support the Occupy movement.
Is it effective?
What's effective today? Anything? And besides, it seems to have sort of run out of steam. But the Tea Party hasn't run out of steam.
Okay. What are your thoughts on the Tea Party?
I think that they're essentially, they have their roots in the same people who would be described in other political systems as fascists. Displaced, angry, mostly formerly middle-class people who somehow blame somebody for their loss of national honor or their personal state in the world. And I think a lot of it has to do with anxiety, which may not even be conscious about America becoming a majority country. I think that's it. It's hard to measure the extent to which that plays, but I think it's an important role.
I'd like to come back from the broad strokes for a moment and just come back to you. At the end of your time at Andrew Jackson High School, you're now a high school graduate. What's the next step? What do you do from there?
Well, I went to work in freight sales with Southern Railway, and for a time was attending night classes at St. John's College. And then, but before I went into service, though, I interned in the office of Claude Pepper his last 2 years in the United States Senate.
What was Claude Pepper like? He's recognized as such a great Floridian, and I'd like to get your personal impressions on the kind of person he was.
He was an extraordinarily brilliant and committed public servant, and I think his defeat was a great loss to Florida. Subsequently, as you know, he found a congressional seat in the Miami area and became the great advocate for seniors.
Mm-hmm. And Social Security.
Well, and he was very involved in the previous solutions to Social Security's financial well-being, mm-hmm. and but he was there trying to assure that it continued to be there for the old people.
Mm-hmm. Now that Senate campaign that you mentioned has become apocryphal in how we talk about differences between the candidates and outcomes. It was between himself and George Smathers, who was also from the University of Florida, and our library is named after. What are your reflections on that campaign?
Well, it was an extraordinarily ugly campaign. There was a flood of money, primarily from the DuPont interests, and the DuPont interests were really dominant in Florida. It's hard to imagine at that time the extent to which one economic interest was so dominant, because they had railroads and banks and office buildings.
Well, do you remember anything about the campaign in particular that made you think, oh my gosh, it's going to turn out a certain way, one way or the other?
Well, Pepper was smeared as a communist, and the whispers about his family, and it was just incredibly ugly. And of course, only 2 newspapers in Florida supported Claude Pepper, one of which has now disappeared. Well, it now has, the family who owned it, who supported Pepper, lost control. That's the Daytona Beach News Journal. The other paper that supported Pepper was the St. Petersburg Times, which is now the Tampa Bay Times, which is, for all practical purposes, the only newspaper we have in Florida. The disappearance of newspapers and their news bureaus means that there are almost no eyes on the legislature, and coverage of local government is very superficial. Investigative journalism has almost totally disappeared, but we have great need of investigative journalists.
What is the need? Why is that important?
So that the public can be informed and make decisions about how they're going to vote on the basis of what is really happening in the society.
I was watching a news report last night on CNN, and Congressman Micah was speaking with Soledad O'Brien about this situation with Fast and Furious, a controversy over whether or not the United States government was buying arms from Mexican drug dealers, and a policeman was killed.
I thought they were selling them to Mexico.
Yes. I bring it up because there was a moment of intense competition between the reporter and the congressman, and where the congressman was saying, well, it doesn't make a difference what you reporters think you found. It's the responsibility of us as the government to investigate, and we're the people who were elected to follow things. So why is it important?
But that's not what they were doing. It was very obvious that they were out to get Holder. If they were really pursuing all the aspects of it, they would have had expert testimony from the ATF or whatever that agency that deals with them, because they only wanted access to the information that would have made it appear, and I do think it was a dumb project. I mean, what can I say? But I don't think that Holder should have been impeached.
Made the Attorney General.
The Attorney General, right?
So you would.
It was the Get Obama move.
So you think, in this instance, the journalists are correct?
Oh, I think so. Micah does not instill me with any generous notions of his commitment to the truth writ large.
Is that the real issue, that the press is sort of the watchdog?
The press needs to be the watchdog. It doesn't rise to that level very often.
What about the responsibility of individual citizens to find this information out for themselves, to be more involved, to be more civic-minded, to ask questions?
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, if the newspapers aren't doing it, and on television, most of what we get is celebrities and gore. You don't very often, and people really don't always want to know. I mean, they do documentaries that need universal audiences, but they certainly don't get them. They don't do them often enough, but I don't know. If it bleeds, it leads is the motto for the newsroom.
In this age, though, with less regulation on the electronic spectrum and a concentration of the ownership of media. The same people that own newspapers now also own books and now also own video and information
and everything.
So what role can the regular citizen, really have?
Well, you need to break up some of the concentration. When I was living in New York, when at that time, in order to own a television station in the United States, you had to be an American citizen. So Rupert Murdoch, who at that time, after having been born and messed up things in Australia, was wrecking things in Canada, he wanted the station, so he became an American citizen. So News Corp is now an American corporation, even though it's polluting the politics of England as well as the United States. It's discouraging, but you need to restore regulation to be sure that you have fairness, and you need to discourage excessive concentrations of wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands.
Some people would say the whole idea of the news covering certain items is just a question of taste. You can always turn the channel, and there we have 500 channels, 1,000 to choose from. You can have the cooking channel, you can have the political channel. Why doesn't that satisfy the public's need?
Well, but then how do you have a collective civic understanding and response to the issues with which we're confronted? That's a major problem. It used to be that even though the papers they printed more people read it. We got our news at 6 o'clock. Almost everybody in the country was watching.
Walter Cronkite, Edward Murrow.
That's right.
Huntley and Brinkley. It's interesting, again, being here in Pugh Hall, because we also share this building with the Bob Graham Center, and Senator Graham.
And he's doing a wonderful job as a citizen.
I was going to ask you about that, his concentration on civic education, and we have that wall downstairs where people can participate in debates.
Well, that was one of the things that he took great leadership on, as has the bar, because we eliminated civics from the curriculum in the public schools. And so Americans don't know anything about history, they don't know anything about civics, so how do you expect them to make an informed, intelligent decision when they go vote?
So you took Americanism versus Communism in school?
Oh, I surely did.
What did you think about that class?
At that time, I thought it was a ideologically driven indoctrination. They tried to equate, and it wasn't very consistent, that socialism and communism were synonymous, yet they would show us a huge map, and here was Berlin, surrounded by the Soviets with a socialist mayor, Ernst Reuter.
Well, they've changed the name now to Comparative Political Systems, but students are also now able to opt out of some of those classes.
I hope it's become a little more fair and balanced than it was at that time. I mean, communism certainly was a dreadful system, but you didn't have to lie about the system or describe other people as being part of it who clearly were not.
If you were a civics and education czar, so to speak, here in Florida in our area, what types of things would you include in a curriculum or offer to help increase civic mindedness and understanding?
That's beyond my pay grade, but I have. You would want to expose the students to a broad range of positions, but expose them to experiences, and that needs to be done. But I think that there are ample people in the education field and so on who could devise appropriate texts and instructional activities.
What is the danger of not being successful in
Bob
Graham's
I think
effort?
we're experiencing it.
In what way?
that we have an ill-informed electorate who are making their decisions about who will be the president or who will even be the mayor without given any real thought to what the issues confronting the body politic are and what its experience and what is the vision for the society. How do we build an inclusive, a fair society in which there's opportunity, and for people who can't make it, that we somehow make adequate provision to see that their basic human needs are accommodated.
Coming back one step further from the broad strokes and to talk about you in particular, how did you come to Gainesville, and what are your involvements in this community?
Well, I chose to come to, I was born in Florida, but I knew I did not want to live in Jacksonville. I had lived in Fort Lauderdale and Tampa, Atlanta, Washington. I lived in New York for 13 years. So coming back to Florida, I quickly eliminated Jacksonville, Fort Lauderdale, Miami, Tampa. So it ultimately came down to a choice of moving to Tallahassee or moving to Gainesville. And I had friends in both places, and they're both lovely communities in many ways. But then I realized that the legislature met every year. And so that would be an aggravation that I didn't want to endure. So that's how I decided to come to Gainesville.
And what year was that?
In 1990.
1990. Now you have been
I
very
now
involved.
have lived in Gainesville longer than I've lived anywhere else in my life.
What is it about Gainesville that keeps you here?
Well, I thought that it has the kind of political and cultural atmosphere that I identified with, and where I could find my way and perhaps make a contribution, which I've tried to do.
And your contributions have been recognized. You were recognized with an outstanding award by the Alachua Democratic Party. Even gave a keynote address.
Well, I don't know if it was a keynote address, but I was honored, and I did make a speech in which I expressed my views about the Democratic Party and its politics. I do remember saying that the Democratic Party was not exactly my home. At its best, it was a way home.
What did you mean by that?
Well, it meant that I don't always support everything the Democrats do, particularly when I think that they have abandoned some kind of broader vision and principle that I think that they should be devoted to.
Mm-hmm. Since we've come to the question of principles, I know one of your interests has been in the history of Florida, and particularly equality issues and how people have been treated. One of the areas that people are beginning to look at more now is the issue of the Johns Committee and those investigations which took place. Could you talk about Charlie Johns for a second, and also about your feelings on what took place during that time?
Well, it was pretty horrendous, but I think that the failure to recognize that this started both in intense racism and hysterical anti-communism, and they almost by accident fell into their gay bashing stuff. But at that time, there was this kind of folk wisdom or ignorance that gays were communists. There was no evidence of that, of course. There may have been a gay communist somewhere, but the Johns Committee was stymied because they had made an effort to seize the records of the NAACP. They wanted the mailing lists, the contribution lists, and fortunately, Dr. A. Leon Lowry, who was at that time head of the NAA in Tampa and the treasurer, relocated the records, so they weren't able to get it, and they were subpoenaing them, and the NAA and the American Civil Liberties Union filed with the U.S. and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the committee did not have access to these records. So this kind of cut off any further and so almost by accident they got involved in the now almost hysterical antics that they went through. But the university suffered greatly because you had a president who cooperated fully with the Johns Committee, and so there were at least one suicide and lots of resignations, but I think it created a climate for a long time of fear, but then a long-range damage of creating a pervasive culture of timidity about dealing with controversial issues. And to some extent, I don't think we've ever recovered.
You seem to be comparing it in a lot of ways with the McCarty hearings, nationally. Is that the Johns Commission would be kind of a Florida equivalent to that in
yes,
some ways?
It was a very redneck edition of it, yes.
When you use the term redneck,
it means people whose background was relatively modest, but who had attained certain, at least in the Johns Committee, but the people in the suits may, in some instances, the SUITS, may have been supportive, but they weren't personally going to get out and do all this stuff.
Charlie Johns would have been described, I guess, as a pork chopper in terms of his connections with being with rural North Florida and the influence that North Florida
had. Which had total dominance of the legislature during the period.
Could you discuss that and how that might come about? Now with 18.5 million people in Florida, people might not see that the same way because there's so many Senate districts and so many House districts for the legislature, but it was different in that era, was it not?
In some respects, but the dominance of corporate interests and money have created a legislature that's we have a governor who spent $27 million of his own money, most of which was ill-gained, to be elected, and everyone knew about his ethical challenges, and they voted for him anyway. Makes you very discouraged about the electorate.
Is that why you work now mostly with local issues? I noticed you're wearing a button for a candidate now, for example.
Well, because he has a vision of an inclusive community in which we conserve rather than deplete our resources, so that we're building a community that will still be here for the next generation. I think that I think Mike Byerly is an extraordinary public servant.
What are some of the issues that you feel strongly about and that you work on these days?
Well, there's a major effort to curtail all the restraints on growth and environmental regulation. Just get rid of all this.
So being a better steward for the environment.
Which would soon mean that we would be building, but Florida is already at a point where we're exceeding the carrying capacity of the state in terms of water resources. And eventually water might become in Florida as expensive as gasoline has been previously. That could happen, and very quickly. Just because we've had we've had Debbie dumping water on us, that's been a great respite, but it hasn't solved the chronic water shortage in the state, which over the years is only going to get worse.
So you see the diversion of the St. John's and the building of the desalination plants in Southwest Florida and more people in South Florida using more water, using more resources as a critical issue?
Well, I think that the water management districts thus far have not set a very sterling record of protecting the long-term public access to water.
If you sat in the place of the director of a water management district, this one, for example, what types of things would you like to see enacted to help?
Well, I would certainly cease approving applications for pumping of water by huge interests, whether it be for designer drinking water, Dasani, or grass to grow beef for those who can afford grass-grown beef.
Several years ago, there was a big controversy about the Swanee American plant being built and the Newberry cement plant. How do you think those controversies have played out over the course of time?
Well, so far, those great interests who want to get access to water are getting permits to do so.
It seems you're saying to the detriment of the public good?
Oh, well, I think that's, yes.
What is the single biggest issue that affects this community, in your opinion?
Well, I think that transportation is increasingly urgent as the Florida population ages and more people either cannot or should not be on the road. We're not offering any inexpensive, convenient alternatives in terms of public transportation. That's one issue. And Gainesville has been very slow in dealing with the realities of its demographics. We finally have attained a senior recreation center, which doesn't suggest that it would normally have the broad range of activities that just a senior center would have. But it's a lovely building, but it still has no funding for staffing a wide range of activity. And the location is not terribly convenient for many seniors. I think we were one of the last cities in Florida to create senior center. Even a little town like Melrose has a senior center. Ocala has one, has had for many years. But I think for a long time there was the feeling that we primarily are a university town, but if you eliminate the university and the Santa Fe populations, this is an aging community.
Surrounded by small communities that depend upon Gainesville for its services.
That's right.
Well, Jack Price, it has been fascinating to chat with you. I hope that this is only the first time that we do this and that we'll sit down and speak again.
I think there may not be much more to cover if we do it again, but it wasn't as challenging as I feared, although I did I now remember the senator, the singing cowboy was Glenn Taylor.
Glenn Taylor. Well, on behalf of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, I'd like to thank you for taking this time to share your reflections and enriching our archives. And with that thanks, I'd like to offer you final privilege of any comment that you'd like to make to close the interview. It could be any thought, and I won't ask any more questions. When you finish, that will conclude our discussion.
I think that the collection of what's happened, which in its total constitutes history, its preservation is an important mission. And I've seen a lot of history. I now live in a world in which I feel I'm ill-prepared and don't understand, but I don't think that among people who attain the same number of years that their experience is all that different.